The fog rolled in thick across the Thames that October evening, transforming the familiar streets of London into something mysterious and threatening. Corporal Marcus Thompson walked steadily through the narrow cobblestone alley that served as his usual shortcut home from his shift at Windsor Castle. At 29 years old, Marcus was a decorated member of the Coldstream Guards, with 7 years of military service that included 2 combat tours in Afghanistan and extensive training in close-quarters combat. Marcus still wore his civilian clothes from his off-duty hours, a simple black jacket and dark jeans that helped him blend into the London crowd. His military bearing was unmistakable, though, evident in the way he carried himself with quiet confidence and maintained constant awareness of his surroundings. Years of combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and tonight something felt different about the familiar route he had walked hundreds of times before. The alley stretched for nearly 200 meters between the main thoroughfare and the residential street where Marcus rented a small flat. During daylight hours, it was a convenient passage used by local residents and workers, lined with the back entrances of shops and small businesses. But at night, especially when the fog was this thick, it became an isolated corridor where sounds seemed muffled and visibility was severely limited. Marcus had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of Manchester before joining the army, and his childhood had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of potential danger. Tonight, those instincts were screaming warnings that he couldn't ignore. The usual sounds of the city seemed strangely absent, and he noticed that the street lights at the far end of the alley appeared dimmer than usual, as if they had been deliberately tampered with. As he walked deeper into the alley, Marcus became increasingly aware that he was being followed. The footsteps behind him were trying to match his pace, attempting to remain undetected. But his military training had made him hypersensitive to such sounds. He could distinguish at least 3 different sets of footfalls, suggesting multiple individuals moving in coordination behind him. Marcus's hand instinctively moved toward his pocket, where he carried a tactical knife that he had purchased legally and kept for personal protection. His military training prohibited him from carrying firearms while off duty, but the blade provided some measure of security in situations exactly like this one. He increased his pace slightly, testing whether his followers would adjust their speed accordingly. The response was immediate and confirming. The footsteps behind him quickened to match his new pace, and Marcus could now hear whispered conversations in what sounded like multiple languages. His combat experience told him that he was dealing with an organized group rather than random street criminals, and that realization made the situation significantly more dangerous. Ahead of him, Marcus noticed movement in the shadows near the alley's exit. Dark figures were positioning themselves across his path, effectively cutting off his route of escape. The tactical situation was becoming clear. He was walking into a carefully planned ambush with attackers both behind and ahead of him. His years of military service had prepared him for exactly this type of scenario. Marcus's mind began automatically assessing his options and resources. The alley offered limited cover, with only a few doorways and dumpsters that could provide temporary protection. The fog that had initially seemed threatening now appeared potentially useful, so it would limit his attacker's visibility, while his combat training would help him navigate and reduce visibility conditions. The young soldier's heart rate remained steady despite the increasing danger, a testament to his extensive combat experience and psychological preparation. He had faced Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan and survived multiple firefights, experiences that had taught him to remain calm under pressure and think tactically even in life-threatening situations. As Marcus continued forward, he began to notice other details that confirmed his worst suspicions. Graffiti on the walls displayed symbols he recognized as gang markings, and the smell of cigarettes and unwashed bodies became stronger, indicating that multiple individuals had been waiting in the alley for some time. This was clearly a planned operation rather than a random encounter. The realization that he had been specifically targeted sent a chill through Marcus's spine. Random muggings were one thing, but planned ambushes suggested either mistaken identity or that someone had been studying his routines and movements. Either possibility meant that he was dealing with individuals who had both resources and motivation to harm him specifically. Marcus's military training kicked into high gear as he began mentally preparing for combat. His years of service had taught him that survival in overwhelming situations required quick thinking, aggressive action, the willingness to use whatever force was necessary to neutralize threats. The young soldier who had once been celebrated for his bravery in Afghanistan was about to face his most dangerous battle on the streets of his own country. The fog continued to thicken around him as Marcus approached the point where the ambush would most likely be triggered. His attackers had chosen their ground well, selecting a location where he would be trapped between two groups with limited options for escape or evasion. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had chosen to target a highly trained combat veteran who had survived some of the most dangerous military operations of his generation. Marcus took a deep breath and prepared himself for what was about to come, knowing that the next few minutes would test every skill he had learned during his years of military service. The quiet alley was about to become a battlefield, and Marcus Thompson was ready to fight for his life. The ambush was triggered when Marcus reached the exact center of the alley, the point where escape in either direction would be equally difficult. The attack began with a shout in a foreign language that Marcus didn't recognize, followed immediately by the sound of multiple footsteps converging on his position from both directions. The fog that had concealed the attackers now worked against them as well, creating confusion and limiting their ability to coordinate effectively. Marcus immediately dropped into a combat crouch, his military training taking over completely as his body moved into defensive positions without conscious thought. His years of combat experience had taught him that the first few seconds of any engagement were critical, that aggressive action was often more effective than defensive measures when facing multiple attackers. From the shadows, ahead of him, emerged four men, each carrying weapons that glinted menacingly in the dim streetlight. Marcus could see knives, what appeared to be a metal pipe, and at least one chain being swung in threatening circles. Behind him, he could hear at least 3 more attackers approaching rapidly, their footsteps echoing off the narrow alley walls. As they closed the distance, the leader of the group, a tall man with distinctive facial tattoos and multiple gold teeth, stepped forward and began speaking in accented English. His words were threatening and crude, demanding that Marcus empty his pockets and remove his watch and wallet. The tone and language made it clear that this was not simply a robbery, but something more personal and violent. Marcus recognized the accent as Eastern European, possibly Romanian or Albanian, and he remembered recent police reports about increased gang activity in this part of London. Well, these were not random street criminals, but members of an organized criminal enterprise that had been expanding their territory and becoming increasingly bold in their operations. The demands escalated quickly as the gang members became more aggressive and impatient. When Marcus failed to immediately comply with their orders, several of them began moving closer while brandishing their weapons more threateningly. Their behavior suggested that violence was inevitable, regardless of whether Marcus cooperated or not. Marcus's combat instincts told him that these men intended to harm him seriously, possibly even kill him, whether he resisted or not. Gang initiations often required violence against innocent victims, and his military bearing may have made him a particularly attractive target for criminals seeking to prove their toughness. The tactical situation was dire but not hopeless. Marcus had been trained to fight multiple opponents in close quarters, and his years of combat experience had taught him how to use terrain and environmental factors to his advantage. The narrow alley that had initially seemed like a trap could also work in his favor by limiting the number of attackers who could engage him simultaneously. Marcus's hand closed around the tactical knife in his pocket as he began calculating angles of attack and identifying which opponents posed the greatest immediate threats. His military training had taught him to prioritize targets based on their weapons and positioning, and to move aggressively to prevent his attackers from coordinating their assault. The leader made a crucial mistake by stepping within striking distance while continuing to make verbal threats. His confidence had made him careless, and he failed to recognize that Marcus was not a helpless victim but a highly trained combat veteran who had survived multiple life-threatening encounters. During his military service, Marcus's first move was swift and devastating. Without warning, he lunged forward and delivered a powerful elbow strike to the leader's throat. A technique he had learned during close-quarters combat training. The impact was precise and brutal, crushing the man's windpipe and dropping him to the ground where he writhed in agony. Unable to breathe or call for help, the sudden violence shocked the other attackers, who had expected an easy victim rather than a trained fighter. Their momentary hesitation gave Marcus the opening he needed to press his advantage and begin systematically neutralizing the threats around him. Marcus drew his tactical knife in a smooth, practiced motion while simultaneously moving toward the nearest attacker, a stocky man wielding a metal pipe. His military training had taught him that in knife fighting, aggression and forward momentum were critical, and that hesitation would prove fatal when facing multiple armed opponents. The pipe-wielding attacker swung his weapon in a wide arc, but Marcus ducked under the swing and drove his knife deep into the man's thigh, severing major blood vessels and immediately incapacitating him. The attacker's scream of pain and shock echoed through the alley as he collapsed, clutching his leg while blood poured between his fingers. The remaining attackers began to realize that they had seriously underestimated their target, but they were too committed to the attack to withdraw safely. The narrow alley prevented them from all attacking simultaneously, forcing them to approach Marcus one or two at a time, which actually worked to his advantage despite being outnumbered. Marcus moved with the fluid efficiency of a combat veteran. Using techniques learned during years of military training and refined through actual battlefield experience, each movement was purposeful and deadly, designed to neutralize threats as quickly as possible while positioning himself for the next engagement. The fog that had initially concealed the ambush now worked in Marcus's favor, creating confusion among the attackers. While his superior training allowed him to fight effectively in limited visibility conditions, his years of military service had included extensive training in night combat and fighting in adverse weather conditions. As Marcus continued to fight, his attackers began to understand that they had made a terrible mistake in choosing him as their target. The confident gang members who had planned to intimidate and rob an apparently helpless victim were now facing a lethal adversary who was systematically destroying their group with professional efficiency and ruthless determination. The third attacker approached Marcus with a long chain that he swung in wide, intimidating circles, clearly believing that the reach advantage would give him the upper hand. However, Marcus had trained extensively with the Royal Marines in weapons disarmament techniques, and he understood that chain weapons, while impressive, had significant vulnerabilities when used by untrained fighters. Marcus waited for the perfect moment when the chain's momentum carried it past its optimal striking position, then moved inside the weapon's arc with lightning speed. His left hand caught the chain while his right drove the tactical knife between the attacker's ribs, puncturing a lung and causing him to drop to his knees. Gasping for air and unable to continue fighting, the fourth attacker from the front group, seeing three of his companions already neutralized, attempted to flee back toward the alley entrance.
However,
Marcus's combat training had taught him the critical importance of preventing enemy forces from escaping to potentially regroup or summon reinforcements. He pursued the fleeing gang member with the relentless efficiency of a predator. Marcus caught the fleeing attacker within 20 meters, tackling him to the ground with a perfectly executed takedown that drove the man's face into the rough cobblestones. The impact was brutal and effective, leaving the gang member unconscious and bleeding heavily from multiple facial lacerations. Marcus quickly zip-tied his hands, using restraints he carried for emergencies, ensuring he wouldn't pose a future threat. With the forward group neutralized, Marcus turned his attention to the three attackers who had been approaching from behind. These men had witnessed the devastating efficiency with which he had dismantled their companions, and their earlier confidence had transformed into obvious fear and uncertainty. They now understood that they were facing a trained killer rather than an easy victim. The largest of the remaining attackers, a massive man with arms covered in prison tattoos, stepped forward wielding a combat knife of his own. His size and obvious experience with violence made him potentially the most dangerous remaining threat. And Marcus recognized that this would likely be his most challenging individual combat of the encounter. The knife fight that followed was brief but intense, with both men displaying considerable skill and experience with bladed weapons. However, Marcus's military training included extensive instruction in knife-fighting techniques developed specifically for military combat. While his opponent's experience came from street fights and prison encounters that were ultimately less sophisticated, Marcus used his superior training to control the distance and tempo of the engagement, forcing his opponent to fight at a disadvantage while creating opportunities for decisive strikes. The larger man's strength was impressive, but Marcus's speed, precision, and tactical thinking proved superior in the confined space of the alley. The decisive moment came when Marcus feinted a high attack, causing his opponent to raise his guard, then immediately switched to a devastating low thrust that severed the femoral artery in the man's thigh. The wound was immediately incapacitating, and the attacker collapsed within seconds as blood loss rapidly sapped his strength and consciousness. The remaining two attackers, having witnessed the systematic destruction of their entire group, finally understood the hopelessness of their situation. These were not hardened criminals, but younger gang members who had been recruited for what they thought would be an easy robbery. Faced with a trained killer who had just eliminated 5 of their companions, they broke and ran. Marcus pursued them with the same methodical determination he had shown throughout the encounter. His military training had taught him that allowing enemies to escape was both tactically unsound and potentially dangerous, as they might return with reinforcements or weapons. The narrow alley limited their escape routes and gave Marcus significant advantages in the pursuit. The first fleeing attacker was caught within 50 meters when he stumbled over debris in the fog-shrouded alley. Marcus's tackle drove the young man to the ground with devastating force, and a precise blow to the base of his skull rendered him immediately unconscious. The second attacker managed to reach the alley entrance but found his path blocked by Marcus, who had anticipated his route and moved to intercept him. This final confrontation was brief and decisive. The young gang member, exhausted and terrified, offered no effective resistance when Marcus grabbed him. A controlled chokehold rendered him unconscious within seconds. Marcus zipped his hands before he could regain consciousness and potentially escape. The entire encounter had lasted less than 8 minutes, but Marcus had successfully neutralized 7 armed attackers using nothing but his military training, tactical knife, and the environmental advantages of the narrow alley. The fog that had initially concealed the ambush had worked to his advantage once he gained the initiative, limiting his opponent's ability to coordinate while his superior training allowed him to maintain tactical awareness. As Marcus surveyed the aftermath of the battle, he was struck by the complete reversal of the tactical situation. What had begun as a carefully planned ambush by a confident gang of criminals had become a one-sided demonstration of professional military combat skills. The attackers, who had expected to intimidate and rob a helpless victim, had instead encountered a highly trained soldier who had systematically dismantled their entire operation. Marcus immediately began assessing his own condition and that of his attackers. His military training included extensive first aid instruction. Despite the violence of the encounter, his professional instincts required him to ensure that the wounded men received appropriate medical attention. Several of the attackers had sustained serious injuries that required immediate treatment to prevent life-threatening complications. The young soldier realized that he now faced a different kind of challenge. The immediate physical threat had been neutralized, but he would need to explain the encounter to police authorities and justify the level of force he had used in self-defense. His military training had prepared him for combat, but navigating the legal and bureaucratic aftermath would require a different set of skills entirely. Marcus immediately pulled out his mobile phone and dialed emergency services, requesting both police and multiple ambulances to respond to his location. His military training had taught him the importance of proper communication with authorities, and he provided clear, precise information about the situation while maintaining his composure, despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. The emergency dispatcher seemed initially skeptical when Marcus reported that he had been attacked by 7 armed men and had defended himself successfully. But his calm, professional manner and specific details about the injuries sustained by his attackers convinced her of the seriousness of the situation. She kept him on the line while coordinating the emergency response. asking detailed questions about the immediate medical needs of the wounded. Attackers, while waiting for emergency services to arrive, Marcus began providing first aid to the most seriously wounded attackers, despite the fact that they had just tried to kill him. His military training had instilled in him a strong ethical code that required him to preserve life whenever possible, even that of enemy combatants who had posed lethal threats just minutes before. The attacker with the severed femoral artery was in the most immediate danger, having lost significant blood and showing signs of shock. Marcus applied direct pressure to the wound while elevating the man's legs, using techniques learned during military combat medicine training. His actions were professional and efficient, focused entirely on preserving life despite the circumstances. Marcus also checked on the gang leader, whose windpipe had been crushed during the initial assault. The man was conscious but struggling to breathe, and Marcus positioned him to maintain his airway while monitoring his vital signs. The injury was serious, but not immediately life-threatening if he received prompt medical attention. The other wounded attackers were stabilized as much as possible with basic first aid techniques, while the unconscious men were positioned to prevent them from choking if they vomited. Marcus's systematic approach to treating his former attackers demonstrated both his medical training and his fundamental humanity. Even in the aftermath of a vicious assault, the first police officers arrived within 12 minutes of Marcus's call, followed closely by 2 ambulances and additional patrol cars. The scene they encountered was unlike anything most of them had seen before. 7 men incapacitated by a single defender who was calmly providing medical aid to his attackers while maintaining perfect situational awareness. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell was the senior officer who took charge of the scene, and her 20 years of police experience had shown her many violent encounters, but nothing quite like this. The systematic and professional nature of the violence, combined with Marcus's immediate provision of first aid to his attackers, created a complex picture that required careful investigation. Marcus provided a clear and detailed account of the UHL attack to Detective Mitchell, explaining his route through the alley, the signs that had alerted him to the ambush, and his tactical decisions during the encounter. His military training had taught him to remember and report tactical situations with precision, and his statement was comprehensive and consistent. The detective was particularly interested in Marcus's background and training, as the level of combat effectiveness he had demonstrated was far beyond that of typical citizens. When she learned about his military service and combat experience, the encounter began to make more sense from both tactical and legal perspectives. Paramedics worked efficiently to stabilize and transport the wounded attackers, with the most seriously injured receiving priority treatment. The man with the severed artery required immediate surgery, while the gang leader with the crushed windpipe needed emergency intervention to secure his airway. The professional medical response was critical in preventing what could have been multiple fatalities. Detective Mitchell examined the weapons recovered from the attackers, noting that they had been carrying knives, a metal pipe, and a chain, all of which could be classified as deadly weapons under British law. This evidence would be crucial in supporting Marcus's claim of self-defense, as it demonstrated the lethal nature of the threat he had faced. The detective also interviewed several witnesses who had heard the commotion and observed portions of the encounter from windows overlooking the alley. Their accounts were consistent with Marcus's statement and provided additional evidence of the premeditated nature of the attack and the defensive nature of his response. Crime scene investigators photographed the alley extensively, documenting the positions where each attacker had fallen and the pattern of blood evidence throughout the scene. The physical evidence told a clear story of a coordinated ambush that had been systematically defeated by superior training and tactics. Marcus was questioned extensively about his actions during the encounter, with particular attention to his decision-making process and the specific techniques he had used to neutralize each attacker. His responses demonstrated both his tactical knowledge and his commitment to using only the force necessary to defend himself effectively. The detective recognized that Marcus's military background and combat experience had saved his life in a situation that would have been fatal for most civilians. His training had not only enabled him to survive the ambush, but it also provided him with the skills necessary to neutralize multiple armed attackers without sustaining serious injury himself. Detective Mitchell also noted Marcus's immediate provision of first aid to his attackers, which demonstrated both his medical training and his character. This behavior was consistent with military rules of engagement and medical ethics, showing that he had acted professionally even in the aftermath of a life-threatening encounter. The legal implications of the encounter were complex but appeared to favor Marcus based on the evidence and witness statements. British self-defense law allowed for the use of reasonable force to defend against imminent threats, and the systematic nature of the ambush clearly supported his claim that deadly force had been necessary for his survival. As the investigation continued throughout the night, it became increasingly clear that Marcus had been the victim of a planned attack by an organized criminal group. Intelligence gathered from police databases revealed that several of the attackers were known associates of an Eastern European gang that had been expanding its territory in London through intimidation and violence. Marcus remained cooperative throughout the lengthy questioning process, providing additional details as investigators requested clarification on specific aspects of the encounter. His military bearing and professional demeanor impressed the police officers, who recognized that they were dealing with a highly trained soldier rather than a typical civilian involved in a violent altercation. The investigation continued for several hours as police methodically documented every aspect of the encounter and its aftermath. Detective Mitchell coordinated with multiple departments, including organized crime specialists who had been tracking the Eastern European gang that the attackers belonged to. The systematic nature of the ambush fit the pattern of intimidation tactics that the gang had been using to establish territory in London. Marcus was transported to the police station for formal questioning, though he was treated as a victim and witness rather than a suspect. His detailed military service record was reviewed, including commendations for bravery in Afghanistan and completion of advanced combat training courses. This background provided crucial context for understanding how he had been able to defeat 7 armed attackers. The formal interview was conducted by Detective Mitchell and Detective Sergeant Robert Hayes, both experienced investigators who specialized in violent crimes. They were impressed by Marcus's precise recall of tactical details and his professional demeanor throughout the questioning process. His military training was evident in the way he organized his thoughts and presented information clearly and logically. Marcus explained his decision-making process during each phase of the encounter, from his initial recognition of the threat to his systematic neutralization of each attacker. His tactical analysis demonstrated sophisticated understanding of combat principles and showed that each action had been calculated to maximize his survival chances while minimizing unnecessary violence. The investigators were particularly interested in Marcus's immediate provision of first aid to his attackers after the threat had been neutralized. This behavior was consistent with military rules of engagement and demonstrated that he had maintained professional standards even under extreme stress. His actions showed both tactical competence and moral character. Hospital reports began arriving throughout the night, providing updates on the conditions of the wounded attackers. The man with the severed femoral artery had undergone emergency surgery and was expected to survive, though he would require extensive rehabilitation. The gang leader with the crushed windpipe had received a surgical airway and was stable, but would likely have permanent voice impairment. The other wounded attackers had sustained various injuries ranging from serious to moderate, but all were expected to make full recoveries. The 3 unconscious attackers had suffered concussions but showed no signs of permanent brain damage. The medical reports supported Marcus's claim that he had used appropriate force given the life-threatening nature of the attack. Detective Mitchell received confirmation from organized crime specialists that the attackers were indeed members of the Kovalev crime family, a Romanian gang that had been expanding aggressively into London territory previously controlled by other criminal organizations. The gang was known for extreme violence and had been suspected in several recent murders and serious assaults. Intelligence reports revealed that the Kovalev gang had been targeting military personnel as part of an intimidation campaign designed to demonstrate their power and ruthlessness. Marcus appeared to have been selected specifically because of his military service, making him a high-value target for a gang seeking to establish its reputation through violence. Against trained fighters, the discovery that Marcus had been deliberately targeted by organized criminals rather than facing a random robbery attempt changed the entire context of the investigation. His successful defense against the attack had potentially disrupted a significant criminal operation and sent a powerful message about the dangers of targeting military personnel. Senior police officials became involved in the case. As its implications became clear, Commander Patricia Williams, who oversaw organized crime operations in London, recognized that Marcus's successful defense could provide valuable intelligence about gang operations and potentially lead to broader arrests and prosecutions. Marcus's military superiors were notified of the incident, and Colonel David Harrison arrived at the police station to provide support and ensure that proper procedures were followed. The colonel was impressed by Marcus's professional conduct throughout the encounter and its aftermath, noting that his actions reflected credit on the entire Guards Division. The legal review process moved quickly as prosecutors analyzed the evidence and witness statements. Crown Prosecutor James Campbell concluded that Marcus's actions clearly fell within the bounds of lawful self-defense. Given the premeditated nature of the attack and the deadly weapons wielded by his assailants, media attention began building. As news of the encounter spread through police channels and reached reporters who monitored emergency service communications, the story of a royal guard successfully defending himself against 7 armed gang members captured public imagination and generated significant interest in both traditional and social media. Marcus was released from police custody after 14 hours of questioning, with Detective Mitchell formally confirming that he would not face any criminal charges related to the encounter. His actions were deemed completely justified under British self-defense law, and his cooperation with the investigation had been exemplary throughout the process. The attackers who had survived the encounter faced serious criminal charges including attempted murder, conspiracy, and possession of deadly weapons. Those who recovered from their injuries would likely face lengthy prison sentences. While the gang's broader operations became the subject of intensive investigation by organized crime specialists, Marcus returned to his flat as dawn was breaking. Over London, physically exhausted but mentally alert from the adrenaline and stress of the prolonged investigation. The familiar surroundings felt strange after the intensity of the night's events, and he struggled to process the fact that his routine walk home had turned into a life-or-death battle. The young soldier realized that his life had fundamentally changed as a result of the encounter. His successful defense against the gang attack would likely attract attention from both criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies, creating ongoing security concerns that would affect his daily routines and personal safety. Marcus also understood that his actions had potentially prevented other innocent people from becoming victims of the Kovalev gang's intimidation campaign. His military training and combat experience had enabled him to achieve something that police had been unable to accomplish, significantly damaging a dangerous criminal organization through direct action, as he attempted to rest and recover from the traumatic encounter. Marcus reflected on the lessons learned and the way his military training had prepared him for civilian life in ways he had never anticipated. The skills that had kept him alive in Afghanistan had proven equally valuable on the streets of London, demonstrating the enduring relevance of professional military training. The story of Marcus Thompson's encounter with the Kovalev gang spread rapidly through both military and civilian communities, creating a media sensation that captured public attention across Britain. News outlets described it as an extraordinary example of military training being used to defend against organized crime, and Marcus found himself thrust into an unwanted spotlight that complicated his normally private life. Within video footage from security cameras in the alley had been obtained by investigators and leaked to media outlets, showing portions of the encounter that confirmed Marcus's account of the systematic ambush and his defensive response. The footage became viral on social media platforms, generating millions of views and extensive commentary about military training and civilian self-defense. Marcus was contacted by numerous journalists requesting interviews, but he declined all. Media appearances on the advice of his military superiors and legal counsel. The Ministry of Defense was concerned about operational security implications of publicizing specific combat techniques. While Marcus personally preferred to maintain his privacy and avoid becoming a public figure, the Kovalev gang's response to the devastating defeat of their ambush team was swift and concerning. Intelligence reports indicated that the gang leadership was furious about the public humiliation and financial losses resulting from the failed attack, and they were actively seeking information about Marcus's identity and location for potential retaliation. Marcus's security situation became a serious concern for both military and police authorities. Commander Williams assigned a protective detail to monitor his residence and escort him to and from his duties at Windsor Castle, while Colonel Harrison arranged for Marcus to receive additional personal security training and equipment. The enhanced security measures significantly impacted Marcus's daily life, requiring him to alter his routines and maintain constant awareness of potential threats. His military training helped him adapt to the new security protocols, but the psychological stress of being a marked man was considerable and required ongoing support from military counselors. Legal proceedings against the surviving gang members moved forward rapidly, with prosecutors building comprehensive cases based on the physical evidence, witness testimony, and intelligence about the gang's broader operations. The defendants faced multiple serious charges that could result in sentences of 20 years or more in prison. Marcus was required to testify at several preliminary hearings, providing detailed accounts of the attack and his defensive actions. His testimony was crucial in establishing the premeditated nature of the assault and the assault in belief that deadly force was necessary for his survival. Defense attorneys attempted to characterize his response as excessive, but the evidence overwhelmingly supported his version of events. The investigation into the Kovalev gang expanded significantly following the failed ambush, with police raids conducted across London targeting suspected safe houses and criminal enterprises. Several high-ranking gang members were arrested, and substantial quantities of weapons, drugs, and stolen property were seized during the coordinated operations. Marcus received recognition for his actions from multiple sources, including a commendation from the Metropolitan Police for his cooperation with the investigation and a military decoration for exemplary conduct under fire. His successful defense against the gang attack was studied by military trainers as an example of how combat skills translated to civilian self-defense situations. The encounter had profound personal effects on Marcus, who struggled with post-traumatic stress symptoms related to the violence and ongoing security concerns. Military counselors helped him process the psychological impact of the attack while developing coping strategies for managing the continued threats from criminal retaliation. Marcus's relationship with his fellow Guards members was strengthened by the incident as they rallied around him with support and admiration for his actions. Many expressed pride that a member of their unit had demonstrated such professional competence under extreme circumstances. Reflecting positively on the entire Guards division, the broader implications of the encounter extended beyond Marcus's personal experience, influencing police tactics for dealing with organized crime and military training programs for personnel transitioning to civilian life. The case became a textbook example of how professional military skills could be applied effectively in civilian self-defense situations. 6 months after the encounter, the surviving gang members were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, with the harshest sentences reserved for those who had initiated the attack and wielded deadly weapons. The convictions effectively destroyed the London operations of the Kovalev gang and sent a powerful message to other criminal organizations about the risks of targeting military personnel. Marcus gradually returned to a more normal routine as the immediate security threats diminished and media attention moved to other stories. However, he remained vigilant about personal security and continued to receive periodic intelligence briefings about potential threats from criminal organizations seeking revenge for the gang's defeat. The psychological impact of the encounter continued to influence Marcus's perspective on civilian life and his military service. He developed a deeper appreciation for the value of his training and the responsibility that came with possessing deadly skills. while also gaining insight into the persistent threats posed by organized crime in urban environments. Marcus began volunteering with veterans organizations to share his experience and help other former military personnel understand how their training could be relevant to civilian life. His story became an inspiration to many veterans struggling with the transition from military to civilian careers. Demonstrating that their skills remained valuable and applicable, the encounter ultimately strengthened Marcus's commitment to military service and public safety, reinforcing his belief that trained professionals had a responsibility to protect innocent people from criminal violence. His successful defense against the gang attack became a defining moment in his military career and personal development. Years later, Marcus reflected on that foggy October night as a turning point that had tested everything he had learned during his military service. The encounter had proven that his training was not just theoretical knowledge, but practical skills that could mean the difference between life and death. The young soldier who had once protected his country in Afghanistan had used those same skills to protect himself and potentially countless other innocent victims on the streets of London. The legacy of that night extended far beyond Marcus's personal experience, influencing police procedures, military training programs, and public understanding of the ongoing value of professional military skills in civilian society. The encounter had demonstrated that the battle against organized crime required citizens with the courage and capability to stand against criminal violence, regardless of the personal costs involved.